You're watching a special edition of Going Underground with me, Afshan Rattansi. As mainstream media bombards us with views on Gaza and Ukraine, we talk to a veteran of imperial wars from Vietnam to Iraq.
That's how reporting works. There are worthy victims and unworthy victims.
Filmmaker and author John Pilger challenges the mainstream media's narrative when it comes to war. Author and filmmaker John Pilger has been covering one war after another for decades, and he has again and again dissected the British media's manipulation and misrepresentation of facts. With me is the journalist and filmmaker John Pilger. John, welcome to Going Underground. Let's begin with the propaganda model as you see it when it comes to the heart of the Middle East, what's been happening in Gaza.
Well, there's a formula. The picture that is painted immediately is that there are two equal sides, and that one side of this equal relationship, in conflict, as they say, the Palestinians, are attacking the Israelis. Yes, there are rockets that have gone from Gaza into Israel. The Palestinians caged in Gaza are up against a state with a bigger air force than Britain's, the fourth biggest military in the world, using drones. The attacks now come. There used to be a few minutes warning, a sense, a sound. No warning now. The drone appears overhead and people are killed, and that's how families are killed. We should be discussing something that everybody knows. These are facts. These are appalling facts, and yet they're reported in a way that calls on us to be sympathetic towards the aggressors, the occupiers, the illegal occupiers of Palestine, and rather suspect the victims. And they are victims. Gaza is under siege. It's constantly being effectively starved. All the historical parallels are there, and yet we don't see it.
On the historical parallels, do you think the way it's reported also seems as if it's very foreign from British interests? Britain has no involvement in this Israeli war machine. It seems quite far away.
Well, Britain does have an involvement in the Israeli war machine. It's been found to have supplied parts to their various American gunships, helicopter gunships, and Britain has supplied bullets to Israel, but apart from these, nothing compared with the United States, which supplies most of it. But Britain is a close ally, in effect, of Israel. And whilst Britain still maintains that the capital of Israel is not in Jerusalem, and it doesn't recognize, as it says, the illegal occupation, it does absolutely nothing to change this truly appalling situation. It's not just an appalling situation, it's the major flashpoint. If there was justice towards the Palestinians, if the problem of Israel, and it's a problem of Israel, not of Palestinians, was solved, then so many other things, so many other problems in the Middle East would fall into place. That's the true tragedy of allowing this to go on, and the media is part of allowing it to go on, because it does its usual job of beating the war drums, of distorting the situation, as I say, of giving the impression that there's a conflict between two sides, instead of the imposition of an illegal occupier on its victims.
Some journalists in the mainstream media who might sympathize with that might say that when it comes to Ukraine, which involves Russia, which actually has been always thought of as a supporter of the Palestinians, incidentally, that also is a different story. It's on the doorstep of Europe. How do you feel about the propaganda model when it comes to the coverage of the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, Western reporting is an extension of the policies of Western governments. Not exactly, and there are many exceptions, honourable exceptions. But the world is seen by the Western media largely in terms, countries are seen, nations are seen, in terms of their usefulness or their expendability. That's how Western policy works. It's still an imperial policy. The world is built on an imperial structure. Nations are made through imperial structures. And that's the way the world is still reported. So when the reporting of Ukraine takes place, it takes on all the assumptions of the last 60 years, the Cold War, a deep anti-Russian sense that runs right through the media, right through the establishment. It goes back a century, of course. I was reading some of the extraordinary dispatches of Morgan Phillips Price, who was the Guardian correspondent, the only Western journalist in Moscow when the Allies, Britain, the United States, and various others, invaded the new Soviet Union in 1919, 1919. And what a different kind of reporting this was. I mean, it was, there was, yes, an empathy with people in the streets, but it was eyewitness reporting. It was fair reporting. And I dare use that word, it was objective reporting. Look at the reporting.
That's quite a big word to use.
That's really, I'm sorry. It's been so warped, that word objective, because the BBC has used it like impartiality and balance to sort of balance stereotypes. You know, that's what it means there. So it's been ripped out of its dictionary meaning in a modern sense. But it's still a noble word, and here was real reporting. Now, Ukraine today, there is a repression indeed, but a suppression of what is happening in Ukraine, of the vicious assaults by this illegitimate coup regime in Kiev, and that's what it is, because the elections that were held following the coup were really only elections in the west of the country. The attacks of this regime on ethnic Russians in the east. Now, I use the term ethnic Russians. You try and find that term in the Western media. It's pro-Russian separatists. Well, my understanding of Ukraine, and it's not an expert understanding by any means, is that for a very long time, the people in the east of Ukraine have wanted a federation, and a democratic federation that represented the ethnic diversity of that country. We get no sense of that from the reporting of Ukraine. As I say, this assault now by this US-backed coup regime in Kiev on the people of the eastern Ukraine, the UN now reports something like 110,000 people fleeing across the border into Russia, many of them women and children. Massacres, atrocities, such as the one in Odessa early in May. 41 people, I think it was, who were burned to death in the trade union headquarters there.
Very, very quickly ignored by the media in favor of other atrocity stories.
Ignored, repressed. You read the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal headline blames the victims. It takes the Kiev regime's version of that story and blames the victims. Can you imagine an atrocity on that scale being reported in that way anywhere else, in those parts of the world where there are worthy victims? Because that's how reporting works. There are worthy victims and unworthy victims. The people of eastern Ukraine, the ethnic Russians and the bilingual people, are unworthy victims because somehow they're mixed up with the unworthiest place of all, and that is Russia.
Join us after the break for part 2 of our interview with John Pilger, who damns British mainstream media for distortion and self-censorship. Welcome back. In the second part of our interview with John Pilger, he tells us how Britain used to have real journalists who told us the truth. It was Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman who published Manufacturing Consent, The Politics of the Mass Media, back in 1988. It argued that mass media in Western capitalist countries consist of ideological institutions that spread propaganda. It uses internalized assumptions and self-censorship as a substitute for overt coercion. In this way, issues such as the Middle East must be reported within confined and strictly observed boundaries so that people do not become aware of their subjugation. But it may seem to some that as scholarship has expanded on the use of propaganda in our media, the worse it has become. It's 25 years, I was counting, nearly 25 years since Chomsky and Ed Herman wrote Manufacturing Consent. You've written countless articles over the years about, say something like that, the IMF and now, of course, in Ukraine. Don't you think there are new generations of journalists? I mean, why aren't there new generations of journalists?
Well, good question.
That are different to the ones that you've talked about in the past 20 years.
Yeah. And what are these journalism schools doing?
Well, they're reading your book, I think.
Yes.
Or do they just put it on the curriculum?
Are they remembering it?
I mean, seriously, I mean, how is it that we can be in the same spot as we were during the Cold War in 2014?
I think one of the reasons, I have a lot to do with student journalists, and I see their dissertations and encourage them. But once they enter a system, and if they find themselves ill-equipped to navigate through that system, once they become a BBC trainee, frankly, they're lost. There are exceptions, I hasten to say, of course.
I haven't met any.
You haven't? Well, you are, because you're a refugee.
I was there. I was not like one on the scheme, as
you
it were.
escaped. No, there are people. Well, I started in documentary filmmaking because of a group of renegade BBC film producers who back then couldn't take the fact that there were boundaries they couldn't cross. But without going into that, the answer to that question is that it's extremely difficult for young people, young budding journalists, going into a diminishing journalistic market. The jobs are fewer. Now, what do? Do they stand up? Yes, they really ought to stand up if they want to. But that takes quite a lot of will and courage on the part of someone so young. So, in other words, I've seen people full of all the idealism of journalism then disappear into systems. I mean,
well, let's just move on now to the public at large, because are they voting with their feet and realizing that the media is kind of not that... The reason why it's not interesting is that it's proven time after time after time to have got Britain involved in one conflict or another, or nearly got us into conflicts of one or another, and just failed. Are people just getting turned off?
Young people, especially. How many young people do you know who read newspapers? I think that's a shame. I love newspapers, but I agree with them. Why should they? Why should they sit in front of the 10 o'clock news, which generally is unwatchable? I watch it either to monitor it or deconstruct it, but that's work. To be informed by it is just not an option.
And so you say Channel 4 News, Newsnight?
No. Yes, occasionally, if there's a story running during the day, there's a moral panic on, as there usually is, about something or other, or there's a Gaza I would want to find out. I would go home from this interview and turn on Channel 4 News. But Channel 4 News is not much better. I saw a piece on ISIS, the jihadist group that is meant to be rampaging through Iraq, the origins of ISIS. There wasn't a single mention in this Channel 4 News report of the role of Britain and America with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, where jihadism, modern jihadism began. There wasn't a single mention of the invasion, the US-UK invasion of Iraq, nothing.
I'm sure the journalists would say there wasn't enough time.
I know.
But is it too much then to say that those programs give us, and give the public at large, or at least those who are watching it, that they help to give us, the people, an illusion that they are actually free at all?
I think they give them illusion. I think you've suggested earlier people disappearing from the media audience. I think they are. I think there's a great deal of awareness among the public, and I don't think many people swallow a lot of that BBC speak anymore.
But you reported behind the so-called Iron Curtain before, and you're now seeing it now. So is it going too far to say that the way the world is being constructed for us on the news is totalitarian?
Well, Orwell said that you don't have to live in a totalitarian country to experience totalitarianism. I think that was very wise. The difference in totalitarian countries like the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, from where I reported and filmed, was that most people knew their media was lying to them. In fact, they developed all kinds of ways of getting around this. There was, in Poland, for instance, there was a wonderful underground theatre where there was a certain code in the theatre that mocked the news. The news wasn't believed. There is still a certain credibility to the news, to BBC News, especially in this country. And that's why so much of the Leveson report, which quite rightly attacked the tabloids for their disgraceful phone hacking and invasion of privacy, but it also was a considerable distraction from where the main problem lies. And the main problem of censorship by omission and censorship by distortion, censorship by establishment understanding of events, lies with that media that has the most credibility. That's the most believable. As I said, I'm not sure that as many people these days are believing it, but it's still confusing. Whereas in the old Stalinist world, Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Poland, elsewhere, people laughed at the news. In fact, I once interviewed the editor of Pravda in Moscow, and we had a very amusing, rather cynical conversation about how little his readers actually believed. Now, I'm not sure we'd have the same conversation here about some of the great newspapers. Yes, we might. People would say, I suspect what I read in the press. But it wouldn't be an overall cynicism that certainly, and that was the late 70s in Moscow, certainly existed there.
John Pilger, thank you.